This is where I live. This is where I exist. There's nothing matters to me. There's nothing means anything to me. I am who I am. Just a killer. These guards will tell you I live in an administrative segregation unit. Until just 6 months ago, I was in isolation in a one-man cell for almost 2 years. What danger am I now? What danger to society is a 71-year-old man in a wheelchair? They don't know what to do with me here. That's right, they don't know what to do with me here. And I don't care. They say if there's no rage involved, if you have one split second to think about what you're doing, it's first-degree murder in this state.
Are you alright for mics? How we sounding?
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Yep.
If this was a second-degree murder like it was supposed to be, I'd probably be in a halfway house somewhere like now, on my way to a nursing home. I was born in McDonald County, Missouri. I grew up 2.5 miles south of Noel on a small farm. Mostly what I remember about those days are just warm kitchens, the smell of biscuits cooking. Sometimes just a dog. I was 5.5 years old when my mother, father, and grandmother were killed in an automobile accident. I was the only survivor. I have no idea how that affected me, losing my parents like that. It was a very caring family at first, but within 5 or 6 years, my mother had begun to drink. And the more she drank, the less involvement with the family she had. My mother's alcoholism had reached a point that I remember her throwing a vodka bottle at me one day, and I walked out of the house when I was about, well, it was before my 17th birthday. And I began to live at the Reddings Mill Inn at that point. The Rings Mill Inn downstairs was a legitimate tavern operation, and the other side of it, there were up to 8 women there at a time. They were prostitutes. They used to kid me, joke with me, but would usually always end every night. Whichever one of them didn't have a trick was taking me back to a room. I began to feel that I had to protect them. I had to take care of them. This was part of my job. They were my family. They were my family. By the time of my 17th birthday, I was an actual pimp for about 6 of the girls that worked there. What it takes to really be a pimp is understanding that your first responsibility is to care for that woman. I took some of these gals off of a truck stop parking lot. You know, I cared for them more than had been previously known in their lives. I believe that as well as I cared for them, they began to care for me more. You know, some people might not call that love. Some people might call it infatuation. But they were there for me, just as I was there for them. Tammy was a prospective prostitute. Around 7:30 p.m. that evening, she offered to show me what she could do on a good Saturday night. We had gotten in the car. At that point, Tammy realized, oops, I don't have any cigarettes. Just stop down here at this convenience store and I'll run in there and get them. That's where it all started on that night. She came back very quickly. I could tell when she came around the corner into my sight that she was upset about something. She was very upset about something. I had started to roll my window down, and even before I got it all the way down, she was, Gary, this he pushed himself up against me. He pushed his groin right up against my butt. When I turned around to tell him to get away from me, he grabbed me by the hand and pushed me back against the counter. Because of what Tammy said to me, I felt that he knew she was a prostitute and he was trying to take her for his own. That is totally unacceptable in my world. It made me very angry. When I saw him at the front of the store, I said, "Boy, I want to talk to you." He turned and ran and got into a brand new Ranger truck. I looked back at Tammy and said, "Get in the car, get in the car." It didn't take 5 seconds to catch up to him. When we came to a stop at 5th and Joplin, I was parked alongside his truck. I remember Tammy saying, "Oh my God, don't do this." I said, "Don't worry about it, honey. I'm going to kick his black ass." The black guy saw me getting out of my car, and at that point, he stepped out of the truck and had what was obviously a bottle wrapped in a brown paper bag. And he said, "Do you want some of me, old man?" And I said, "Nothing but your bucking ass, boy." He swung the beer bottle. It knocked me to my right knee. When I rose drawing that blade. I swung right up over his shoulder into the side of his neck with that blade. The arterial spray of blood that shot out was probably 4 to 6 feet. It was just like a garden hose of water squirting. And he went, "Oh my God, oh my God." And I stepped back away from him and watched him stagger back towards the truck. I returned to my car. As I got in, I threw the blade on the dash. I pulled the door closed. Tammy said, "Oh my God, what happened?" And I said, "Nothing, honey. It's just another down." We returned to the house, packed some clothes. I got a key to a trailer, a mobile home, about 45 miles away, and we drove down there to spend the weekend and just wait and see what would happen.
This is my favorite all time, right here.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Look at, he was happy. Right in the middle, there's the two big brothers.
My name is Charlie Kibbe Johnson, and I am the mother of Jason Oscar Johnson.
I'm Oscar B., the father of Jason Oscar. Who's that?
Everybody knew him, even growing up, as he was grown, they knew him by that smile that he had, because he's a happy individual.
In sports, he was always at the top notch.
University of Cincinnati Wildcats.
Yeah.
Go, Jason, go. They would pretty much compare him to some of the professional athletes. He was good. He was good.
He was great. He was better than good.
This is Jason's girlfriend. That was the love of his life. And I'm sure that had things not changed, they would have been husband and wife today. We drove to Joplin. We got there approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, and they explained to us that he had lost a lot of blood, which had caused multiple strokes.
We had to go in the conference. Had to decide what to do.
Oscar and I decided that what good is anybody that's a vegetable? If you don't know who you are, you don't know where you are, that was not our son. Our son was a vibrant, intelligent, loving, and caring individual. We made the decision to take him off of the life support. I remember saying, Jesus is waiting on you. He's waiting on you, and it's going to be okay. And he took his last breath. I was there when my baby took his first breath, and unfortunately, I was there when my baby took his last breath.
One could say pretty easily that this is a good versus evil case. Nothing suggested anything other than good on Jason Johnson. Nothing suggested anything other than evil for Gary Black. My name is Darren Gallup, and in 1998, I was the lead detective in this case. A lot of people refer to this as the Gary Black case, but really this is all about Jason Johnson, and he was the victim, and so it's really about him. And this is the Joplin Police Department here. Gary has to justify this as saying it's a street fight, so it would lend obviously to the self-defense theory. There was no intent or premeditation, but that's just not what the evidence shows. There's just no way that this can be conceived as a street fight, which then caused Gary to pull a knife in self-defense. There was no evidence that suggested any of that. The evidence that we had said that Gary Black pulled up next to Jason Johnson while he was seated in his vehicle, gets out, pulls a knife, and stabs Jason Johnson in the throat. You can look in here, and it's obvious that he was sitting in the truck whenever he was stabbed in the throat. Blood would not have gotten into this truck if the altercation happened outside the truck. This is the knife used as the murder weapon. When somebody takes a knife out, especially a knife like this, and lunges it into the throat of a person sitting in a vehicle, the only result that they can expect is for that to be a killing. That is a first-degree murder. That's premeditated murder.
I do not regret the death of Jason Oscar Johnson. He was a fake player. He stepped into a game that he knew nothing about. Jason Oscar Johnson knew she was a prostitute, knew she was an open prostitute, a free prostitute, and he was trying to take her for his own. I saw the video from that convenience store. I saw him grinding his groin up against her from behind at a counter. I saw her turn to face him, and I saw him grab her by the hand, push her backwards against that counter, and say something to her. He wanted to play, I can take care of you better than anybody else. He wanted to play, I am a pimp. What he played was dead.
Well, it's just straight lies, is what it is. It just goes to show you what type of a person Gary is. He will make stuff up just to make himself look better. And he continues to victimize Jason. Jason Johnson was not a pimp. There's no evidence to support it, and you can just look into your heart and know that that's just wrong. So it just shoots like one frame at a time. Well, Jason is standing at the counter, buying what he's buying, and then this is Tammy right here. And this is where the alleged bump or whatever occurred. This is Tammy, and this is Jason right there. And that was it. I mean, it was literally a second and a half of an interaction there. So any claims of Jason was trying to sexually assault or do something inappropriate to Tammy, it's obvious in the video that that's not what occurred. Even if Jason would have said something, you know, why would anybody think that that's okay to stab somebody in the throat just for bumping into your girlfriend or your wife, or, as Gary might put it, his prostitute? These are all the tattoos on Gary Black the day that I talked to him. And this is a German Nazi SS tattoo. I really believe that Gary stabbed Jason in the throat and killed him because he was trying to save face. And the fact that Jason was black, you know, Tammy testified that whenever Gary got out of the car and stabbed Jason, and then he got back into the car, he turned to Tammy and said one N-word down. That certainly led credence to it being a racially motivated crime. Through our investigation, we felt like that this one was a first-degree murder and that it warranted the death penalty. The only question was if the jury agreed with us or not. You have to have certain aggravators in the state of Missouri for the death penalty. One of those aggravators is the past history. This was not the first violent crime that Gary had committed.
You ever had a dream about the Bogeyman? Gary Black's my Bogeyman. This is where I was supposed to die. I have been up here probably 35 years. I'm sure that I'll have nightmares tonight about it. Back in March 1976, it was a Friday night, and I'd picked up my girlfriend and taken her out to a date, and I brought her up here. We saw a car pull up the hill. They pulled in behind me and stopped. They blocked me in. Gary Black popped up in this window here, driver's side, and with a sawed-off shotgun, and said they was police. Told me to get out of my car, so I got out of my car. They spread me eagle up against the car. They picked up my bellfold and keys, and then they shot me. I remember I could feel the blood running out my side, and I could feel the coldness creeping up my arms. Just cold, just like I was going numb, but it was cold. I was bleeding to death. I got over 40 pellets still in me. I got 2 in my heart. They had to remove half my lung. Had to remove my spleen. If Gary Black had been released as early as he did and put back out on the streets, then he wouldn't have had a chance to do what he did on murdering the other guy. It just floored me. He should have stayed in jail. I feel for the family on the other person, and just so sad, so preventable.
What good does it do to kill someone for having killed someone else? If all you do is kill the other person, then the death of the one person becomes meaningless. Does Gary deserve compassion? Every human being deserves compassion. If your attitude is that there's some people that are just so horrible, I mean, maybe you can't find compassion for them, and that's within you, but they're human beings. And no matter what they've done, they deserve a criminal justice system that treats them fairly. If you look back at Gary's 1976 sentence, with respect to whether or not Gary deserved a second chance when he got paroled, I think he did. You know, we don't have any magic compass to tell us whether or not this person is going to commit another offense or not. It was right to see if he changed. There's no other way to find out if he's changed. You know, you can go, what if, what if, what if? What if, you know, if he'd have been kept in prison, then maybe he wouldn't have been out and maybe he wouldn't have killed Mr. Johnson. You know, it's all what ifs. I think that a lot of the anger that Gary had that made him a dangerous person when he was younger, it's gone out. I don't think society is gaining anything by having Gary incarcerated at this point. The point of prison has come to be keeping them away from the rest of society where they might hurt people or take people's property or something like that. It doesn't really accomplish much. I just don't think that there's that much justification for keeping him in prison. Gary's pretty harmless now.
I think Gary Black will always be a threat to society or to any institution that he's kept in. We've had some very manipulative inmates, but none as truly evil as Gary. My name is Becky Stevens. My role at the Jasper County Sheriff's Office, I am the current captain. I learned about Gary Black before I started working here. I learned about him in the police academy at the local university. They would teach courses, and he would be the example for their courses. He had a pretty good reputation for, I don't know how to describe it, but just for being dangerous. I guess that's the best way to put it. You know, we have some behavior modification techniques, which is basically loss of privileges or not letting them out of their cell for so many hours. Gary didn't care. There was nothing that mattered to him. He didn't have anybody that came to visit. There was nothing for him to behave for. He would be aggressive towards the officers. He could get to you even, you know, if he was locked in his cell. You can still yell, and then he would get the other inmates to go and do his biddings for him. That's just the way it was. He lives on the torment of others. I don't know if I could have words to describe how racist Gary Black is. If we placed an inmate of color into that housing unit where Gary was located, he would make their life a living hell. Daily, all day long, the mental attacks, the psychological warfare. I believe Gary Black still poses a threat to society, even in prison. And an individual like Gary, who has no care for human life, is very dangerous no matter where he's at.
What do you do with somebody like Gary Black? He's the most dangerous person that I have ever prosecuted. My name is Norman Rouse, and I was the lead prosecutor in the Gary Black trial. The fact that he got life without parole, sometimes that's just the way it is in the process, but was very hard to take.
Life without parole makes me very angry. If I did not have a sentence of life without parole, I would have 22 years done on this conviction. And I would be very close to be making parole on a regular life sentence, which in Missouri is considered to be 30 years for the purposes of parole. There are no incentives to behave yourself. There is nothing you gain. There is no incentive for a man with life without parole to live in any other way.
Gary Black's allegation that but for life without parole, I wouldn't be violent. We can go back and look at the prison records long before he got life without parole. In 1993, there's a report here where he stabbed another inmate. And in 1999, he actually assaulted a jail officer and caused damage to his left eye. So these are just clear incidents of his continued violence when life without parole was not an issue. Keep in mind, we just have his violence while he's in prison. There's a lot of criminal records out there that we haven't looked at. So this is just, so to speak, the tip of the iceberg, simply out of the prison system. Keeping him in prison with life without parole, which a lot of people believe is appropriate as opposed to the death penalty. As you can see from his records, all these records, it doesn't keep him from being violent. I think he's very lucky to be alive. In fact, all of his records vindicate and substantiate that he deserves the death penalty.
Good morning, everyone. We just thank God for this is another day that God chose to wake us up. I do the prayer line every morning, Monday through Friday. Currently, we have about 67 people that come on. I believe my duty after the death of my son is to help others who have experienced similar circumstances and situations. To help others realize that life still goes on. But God is always our refuge. He's always our strength. The anger that I had has changed. Yes, He is. We thank God. As a Christian, I have to forgive. It took a while, it took a long time, but I can tell you sincerely that I have forgiven him. I have forgiven him. I'm not in favor of the death penalty. There's no real purpose and there's no real gaining of anything. If he was executed, he would not have had time to feel remorseful. I want him to think about it. I want Gary Black to spend the rest of his life seeing the face of Jason Johnson.
had another little heart attack, went to Jeff City for a stroke, and just getting by. I've been given a type of medication that thins my blood to keep me from having another stroke, and it results in easily bruising around my eyes. They say they're monitoring it, and they're getting it under control. I don't know. It should have been a second-degree murder. Jason Johnson got out of that truck completely. He hit me with a bottle, and I stabbed him in the side of the neck. That fast, that quick. Just as he hit me, I stabbed him. It was over.
There's just no way that this can be conceived as a street fight. The eyewitness testimony and everything that we put together suggested Gary Black pulled up next to Jason Johnson while he was seated in his vehicle, gets out, pulls a knife, and stabs Jason Johnson in the throat. That is a first-degree murder. That's premeditated murder.
I could care less what he says. I believe that I did what was right. I feel that the CCTV shows that a black man made sexual contact with his groin against a white woman's butt, and anything that happened after that was legitimate. I wanted to kill him from the moment that truck come to a stop at 5th and Joppa, and I knew he couldn't get away from me. It was cross traffic. I knew he couldn't go any farther. Now it's me and you. You want to see how tough you are, how big you are? Let's find out. Let's find out if you really want to play in this real game. Right at that moment, I knew he was dead, and he died.
Are you a racist?
Definitely. I am definitely a racist. I grew up in the Klan. I grew up around it.
Gary Black is unique in his disregard for humans and treatment of humans. Keeping them in prison with life without parole, which
A lot of people believe is appropriate as opposed to the death penalty.
it doesn't keep him from being violent. I've often thought, what do you do with a person like Gary Black?
Sit here and cost the state of Missouri money. That's what I do with myself. I sit right here and cost the whole state of Missouri every penny I can get for the rest of my life. Dying, even dying, you people are going to pay for me.
There are crimes that fade into history, their headlines yellow with age, their evidence gathers dust inside forgotten storage rooms, their victims become names spoken only during anniversaries. Then there are crimes that refuse to disappear, crimes that linger in neighborhoods long after the police tape is gone, crimes that change the way people lock their doors, raise their children, and trust the silence outside their bedroom windows. For more than 40 years, California lived with one such nightmare. No one knew his face, and no one knew his name. Only his victims knew his voice. It was calm, controlled, almost emotionless. Sometimes he whispered threats. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he cried. Sometimes he stood in complete silence, letting terror itself become his weapon. He broke into homes while families slept. He watched. He waited. And then, without warning, he transformed ordinary nights into scenes of unimaginable horror. Investigators would eventually give him several names. The Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. For years, detectives believed these were different men, different monsters, different investigations scattered across hundreds of miles. They were wrong. Behind every shattered window, every bound couple, every stolen keepsake, every unsolved murder, stood one man, Joseph James D'Angelo. But for nearly half a century, no one knew. The story begins not with murder, but with something almost easier to dismiss: a burglary. In the quiet agricultural city of Visalia, California, residents noticed something deeply unsettling during the early 1970s. Homes were being entered without obvious signs of forced entry. Small objects disappeared: coins, jewelry, personal photographs, strange items with little monetary value. Sometimes nothing valuable was taken at all. Instead, furniture had been moved. Drawers were opened. Clothing was scattered across bedrooms. The children's rooms were disturbed. Whoever was entering these houses wasn't simply stealing. He was exploring, learning, studying. The intruder seemed fascinated by the intimate details of strangers' lives. He moved confidently through dark homes, suggesting he had already memorized the layout before stepping inside. Police believed they were dealing with an unusually active burglar. Nothing more. At first. But the number of break-ins kept climbing, then climbing again. Soon dozens became hundreds. Residents stopped sleeping peacefully. Dogs barked at empty yards. The curtains stayed closed. Neighbors began watching neighbors. Parents checked locks twice, then 3 times. Fear spread faster than facts. Witnesses occasionally reported seeing a young white man running through neighborhoods after midnight. Athletic, lean, fast enough to disappear before officers arrived. He climbed fences with ease, crossed rooftops, vanished into orchards and canals that surrounded the city. Every encounter ended the same way: gone. As investigators struggled to identify the mysterious burglar, something even darker happened. On September 11th, Sill, 1975, 16-year-old Claude Snelling walked outside his Visalia home after hearing strange noises. His daughter had been asleep inside. An intruder had entered her bedroom. When Snelling confronted the masked man, gunfire erupted. The teenager inside heard screams. Neighbors heard shots. By the time police arrived, Claude Snelling lay dying outside his own home. The attacker escaped into the darkness. It was the first confirmed killing connected to the unknown predator. Yet even then, authorities couldn't fully understand what they were facing. The burglar had become a killer. Or perhaps he had always been one. The Visalia investigation intensified. Detectives collected shell casings, interviewed witnesses, tracked footprints, studied burglary patterns. One police officer, Detective William McGowan, came dangerously close to ending the mystery. Late one night, McGowan encountered a suspicious figure moving through a neighborhood. The officer challenged him. The suspect responded with gunfire. Bullets narrowly missed the detective. Again, the man escaped. The encounter left investigators with one undeniable conclusion: their burglar carried a gun, and he would use it without hesitation. Still, despite hundreds of crimes, countless interviews, surveillance operations, and patrols, the Visalia ransacker simply vanished. Almost overnight, the burglary stopped. The city slowly exhaled. The residents believed the nightmare had finally ended. They couldn't have imagined the truth. The nightmare hadn't ended. It had simply moved. Nearly 300 miles north, another California community was preparing to experience a terror unlike anything it had ever known. Sacramento County, June 18th, Sill, 1976. A young woman lay asleep inside her home. The window had been quietly opened. A man wearing a ski mask slipped inside. He carried a flashlight, shoelaces, and absolute confidence. He woke her with a beam of light directly in her eyes. Before she could scream, he threatened to kill her. She was assaulted inside the place where she should have been safest. Before leaving, the attacker stole small personal belongings. And nothing about the crime made sense. There was no obvious motive beyond domination. No fingerprints investigators could use. No witnesses who saw his face. Just another woman left traumatized. Police hoped it was an isolated attack. They were catastrophically mistaken. Weeks later, he struck again. Then again. Then again. The pattern became unmistakable. Young women living alone. Ground floor homes. Open spaces behind neighborhoods. Creeks. Parks. Drainage canals. Escape routes carefully selected long before each attack. Investigators noticed something chilling. The offender often entered homes days before the assaults. He unlocked windows, moved objects, stole photographs. Sometimes he made silent phone calls to victims after watching them for days. Women answered their telephones expecting friends or family. Instead, breathing. Nothing else. Just breathing. Sometimes a whisper. "I'll kill you." Then the line went dead. Victims later realized those calls had come before the attacks. He had already chosen them. He simply wanted them to know someone was watching. Fear became part of daily life throughout Sacramento. Women stopped jogging alone. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts. Neighborhood meetings filled school auditoriums. Police departments received hundreds of suspicious person reports every week. Everyone seemed to notice strange cars, unknown men, footprints, open gates. Every shadow became suspicious. Every noise after midnight felt personal. Newspapers struggled to describe the growing panic. Television stations interrupted regular broadcasts with crime updates. Residents learned a new phrase: the East Area Rapist. The name spread rapidly. Not because anyone knew who he was, because everyone feared becoming his next victim. Detectives soon realized they were facing someone unlike any offender they had previously encountered. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't reckless. He was disciplined, patient, calculated. He spent hours hiding behind fences, listening, learning routines. He knew when husbands worked late. He knew which homes had dogs. He knew where police patrols usually turned around. He appeared to understand investigative procedures remarkably well. Crime scenes suggested military precision. Victims described hearing him whisper commands with chilling confidence. "Don't move. Don't look at me. I'll kill you." He tied elaborate knots. He stacked dishes on the backs of male victims while assaulting their partners. If the dishes rattled, he claimed he would immediately execute everyone inside the house. It was psychological torture. Every tiny sound became unbearable. Every breath carried the possibility of death. Many survivors later admitted they believed they would never leave those bedrooms alive. The assaults continued month after month. Investigators worked around the clock. Hundreds of officers joined task forces. Behavioral analysts began constructing psychological profiles. The offender was likely young, physically fit, organized, comfortable moving in darkness, possibly employed in a profession requiring discipline, possibly someone familiar with police methods. Yet those profiles produced no suspect. Every lead dissolved. Every tip ended in disappointment. Still, the attacker made mistakes, or at least what seemed like mistakes. He occasionally lost items, left shoe impressions, allowed victims to hear fragments of his voice. Some described him as surprisingly young. Others thought he sounded older. His breathing changed constantly, sometimes frantic, sometimes perfectly calm. One victim believed he was crying during the assault. Another remembered hearing him mutter to himself in apparent frustration. Several described moments when he seemed almost detached from reality. The contradictions baffled psychologists. Was this genuine emotion, or another layer of manipulation? No one knew. Then investigators discovered something even stranger. He wasn't merely selecting victims at random. Many homes shared subtle characteristics: accessible fences, open fields nearby, creek systems connecting entire neighborhoods, invisible escape routes that ordinary residents barely noticed. The offender used California's suburban geography like a private highway. By the time officers surrounded one neighborhood, he had already crossed 2 canals and disappeared into another. Police helicopters searched from above. K9 units searched below. Nothing. He seemed to dissolve into darkness itself. Public frustration intensified. Citizens demanded arrests. Editorials criticized law enforcement. Radio stations debated whether a serial offender could truly outsmart so many agencies. Behind closed doors, detectives asked themselves the same question: how could one man repeatedly defeat hundreds of trained investigators? The answer wasn't simple. He studied them. Police radios, response times, media coverage, neighborhood patrol schedules. Every public announcement became information he could exploit. Sometimes, after officials increased patrols in one district, he attacked somewhere else. almost as though he had anticipated every move. Some investigators quietly wondered whether the offender possessed law enforcement training. There was no evidence proving it. But the idea refused to disappear. It explained his confidence, his discipline, his uncanny ability to vanish. Yet it also sounded almost impossible. Surely a police officer couldn't be responsible for such horrifying crimes. Surely not. Meanwhile, the victims continued to multiply. Each investigation looked nearly identical. Night, darkness, flashlight, threats, found victims, carefully controlled violence, minimal physical evidence, a silent escape. Families began sleeping together in single rooms. Men bought firearms. Women installed alarms. Children were told never to answer telephones after dark. California was changing. Not because of war, not because of natural disaster, because somewhere, every single night, one invisible man was deciding whose life would never be the same again. And while investigators desperately searched for the East Area rapist, none of them realized the most terrifying chapter of the story had not yet begun. The man they were hunting was still evolving. The violence was growing. The confidence was growing. The distance between breaking into homes and taking lives was becoming frighteningly small. Soon, the predator who had already shattered hundreds of lives would cross another line, a line from which there would be no return. The investigation grew more complex with every passing month, not because detectives lacked determination, but because every new crime seemed to confirm that the offender was learning alongside them. By late 1976 and into 1977, law enforcement agencies throughout Northern California faced a criminal unlike any they had previously encountered. The attacks continued to follow a recognizable pattern, yet the offender demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt whenever investigators changed tactics. Each new incident added another layer to an already enormous case file, but it also produced fresh questions that proved increasingly difficult to answer. At the time, California's law enforcement system operated very differently from today. Police departments maintained separate records, separate evidence rooms, and separate investigative teams. Computerized databases capable of instantly comparing reports across jurisdictions did not yet exist. Information traveled through telephone calls, mailed reports, and face-to-face meetings between detectives. As the offender crossed city and county boundaries, coordination became a significant challenge. Despite those obstacles, similarities between the attacks became impossible to ignore. Crime scene investigators documented recurring methods of entry, consistent behavioral patterns, and forensic evidence indicating that many of the assaults had been committed by the same individual. Victim interviews, while understandably varied in detail due to the traumatic nature of the crimes, described a remarkably similar sequence of events. The offender displayed careful planning, exercised control over victims through threats rather than unnecessary physical violence, and often remained inside residences longer than investigators would normally expect. One of the most important developments came through forensic science. Although DNA analysis was still years away from becoming a practical investigative tool, crime laboratories were able to compare biological evidence recovered from multiple scenes. Those examinations strongly indicated that the same offender was responsible for numerous assaults across Sacramento County and surrounding communities. This confirmation transformed what might otherwise have been viewed as isolated investigations into a large-scale serial offender case. With that realization came an extraordinary challenge. Every additional confirmed attack meant more victims to support, more neighborhoods to canvass, and more evidence to process. Detectives worked exceptionally long hours, reviewing reports late into the night while attempting to identify any detail that might distinguish one crime from another. Investigators revisited earlier witnesses, reconstructed timelines, and examined maps repeatedly in search of geographic patterns. Those maps gradually revealed something significant. Many of the affected neighborhoods shared environmental characteristics that favored a careful intruder. Residential developments bordered canals, creeks, utility corridors, or open fields that provided concealed routes of approach and escape. The offender appeared comfortable navigating these areas in complete darkness. Rather than relying on streets illuminated by lamps or monitored by passing traffic, he consistently chose routes that reduced the likelihood of detection. This observation led to expanded patrols in parks, drainage systems, and greenbelts during overnight hours. Officers conducted stakeouts in neighborhoods considered vulnerable based on previous attacks. Unmarked vehicles blended into residential streets while plainclothes officers watched for suspicious movement. Canine units searched areas where footprints or discarded items had been discovered. Yet despite these efforts, the offender repeatedly avoided capture. On several occasions, responding officers arrived within minutes of reported incidents. Search teams established perimeters, helicopters scanned surrounding areas, and neighboring agencies joined coordinated operations. Nevertheless, the suspect disappeared before anyone obtained a clear identification. These narrow escapes became some of the most frustrating moments in the investigation, reinforcing the impression that the offender possessed exceptional awareness of his surroundings. Public concern intensified accordingly. Community meetings attracted hundreds of residents seeking information and reassurance. Law enforcement officials encouraged homeowners to strengthen doors and windows, improve exterior lighting, and report unfamiliar individuals or vehicles. Neighborhood watch programs expanded rapidly throughout affected communities. Residents exchanged telephone numbers, organized evening patrols, and remained alert to unusual activity. The psychological impact extended well beyond those directly victimized. People altered daily routines that had previously seemed ordinary. Evening walks became less common. Windows that once remained open during warm California nights were locked before sunset. Some families purchased alarm systems, while others relied on additional locks and reinforced doors. Local businesses reported increased sales of flashlights, outdoor lighting, and home security equipment. Media coverage reflected the growing anxiety. Newspapers published detailed maps showing the locations of confirmed attacks. Television broadcasts summarized investigative developments and featured interviews with detectives urging continued vigilance. Radio stations repeated public safety announcements during evening programming, reminding listeners to secure their homes and remain aware of suspicious activity. This extensive publicity presented investigators with both advantages and disadvantages. Greater public awareness generated valuable tips. Citizens reported unfamiliar vehicles, suspicious behavior, and possible sightings that otherwise might never have reached police attention. Every telephone call received careful evaluation, no matter how unlikely it initially appeared. At the same time, the overwhelming number of leads consumed enormous investigative resources. Many reports ultimately proved unrelated to the offender. Innocent misunderstandings, neighborhood rumors, and mistaken identities required detectives to spend valuable time verifying information that rarely advanced the case. The offender himself appeared aware of the media attention surrounding the investigation. Although investigators remained cautious about drawing conclusions regarding his motivations, the timing and locations of several attacks suggested a willingness to continue offending despite extraordinary public scrutiny. Rather than withdrawing as police activity increased, he demonstrated continued confidence in his ability to avoid identification. Behavioral specialists consulted by investigators attempted to construct a psychological profile based solely on documented evidence. They emphasized that offender profiling could not identify a specific individual, but it might help narrow investigative focus. The resulting assessments suggested someone who planned offenses carefully, maintained considerable self-control during preparation, and derived satisfaction from exercising power over victims. The profile also highlighted the likelihood that the offender maintained an outwardly ordinary public life. He may have held steady employment. He may have interacted routinely with neighbors. He may have appeared entirely unremarkable outside the context of his crimes. That possibility deeply unsettled investigators. If accurate, it meant the individual responsible for generating widespread fear might blend effortlessly into everyday society. Meanwhile, forensic technicians continued collecting every available piece of physical evidence. Footwear impressions were photographed and measured. Tool marks on windows and doors underwent microscopic comparison. Fibers, hairs, and other trace materials received careful laboratory examination according to the best scientific methods available at the time. Although these techniques could not reveal a name, they allowed investigators to compare scenes with increasing confidence. As the evidence accumulated, connections between cases strengthened. Task forces expanded accordingly. Detectives from multiple jurisdictions met regularly to exchange information. They compared witness statements, reviewed evidence inventories, and discussed emerging theories. Cooperation between agencies improved steadily, reflecting recognition that the offender operated without regard for municipal boundaries. Still, critical questions remained unanswered. How did he select victims? How much surveillance occurred before each attack? Did he act entirely alone? Where did he go immediately afterward? Investigators considered numerous possibilities but found little definitive evidence supporting any single explanation. Some victims appeared to have no obvious connection to one another beyond geographic proximity. Others lived in neighborhoods that had experienced previous incidents. Whether these similarities reflected deliberate planning or coincidence remained uncertain. As months passed, another realization emerged. The offender's methods were not entirely static. While core elements remained consistent, investigators documented subtle changes in behavior over time. Such evolution is not unusual in serial investigations, and detectives understood that offenders may alter tactics in response to experience, perceived risk, or changing circumstances. Consequently, investigators avoided relying too heavily on rigid assumptions regarding future offenses. This flexibility became increasingly important as the investigation entered another phase. By 1978, authorities had assembled one of the largest serial crime investigations California had yet experienced. Hundreds of officers, detectives, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and support personnel contributed to the effort. Thousands of documents filled filing cabinets. Countless hours had been invested in interviews, surveillance, evidence analysis, and public outreach. Yet the central objective remained unmet. The offender's identity was still unknown. Looking back decades later, investigators would acknowledge how challenging the technological limitations of the era had been. Modern tools such as automated DNA databases, digital surveillance networks, mobile phone records, license plate readers, and advanced geographic information systems simply did not exist. Detectives relied instead on persistence, careful documentation, and the hope that one overlooked detail might eventually unlock the case. Even so, they refused to abandon the investigation. Every new report received attention. Every piece of evidence was preserved. Every confirmed connection strengthened the historical record that future investigators would inherit. That commitment would ultimately prove invaluable, though no one involved could have anticipated how important those preserved exhibits would become decades later. For the moment, however, the investigation stood at a difficult crossroads. Public fear remained high, investigators continued pursuing leads, and the offender had not been identified. More troubling still, evidence suggested that his criminal behavior was continuing to evolve. The next phase of the case would extend beyond Northern California and challenge assumptions about whether investigators were pursuing one offender or several. Years later, advances in forensic science and careful comparison of evidence would reveal that these seemingly separate investigations formed part of a single, extraordinary criminal history, one that would eventually become known worldwide as the Golden State Killer case. By the close of the 1970s, investigators found themselves confronting an unsettling possibility. Although the series of sexual assaults in Northern California had established a clear behavioral pattern, new violent crimes occurring hundreds of miles away began attracting attention for reasons that could not easily be dismissed. At first, the similarities appeared circumstantial. Different jurisdictions were involved, the victims were not connected, and the crime scenes differed in important respects. Yet experienced detectives understood that serial offenders can evolve over time, altering methods while preserving underlying behavioral characteristics. The question was no longer simply whether the East Area rapist would strike again. It was whether investigators were looking at the beginning of something even more dangerous. In Southern California, several homicide investigations shared elements that troubled seasoned detectives. The victims were attacked inside their homes during the night. Entry often appeared deliberate and carefully planned. Evidence suggested the offender had exercised significant control over the crime scene before leaving with remarkably little physical evidence behind. At the time, these murders were investigated independently. There was no immediate reason to conclude they were connected to crimes committed hundreds of miles away. Each jurisdiction focused on solving its own homicide, interviewing neighbors, examining physical evidence, and pursuing local suspects. The limitations of communication between agencies remained a significant obstacle. Detectives exchanged information through meetings, telephone conversations, and written reports, but there was no centralized nationwide database capable of rapidly identifying behavioral similarities across dozens of cases. Despite these challenges, a handful of investigators remained convinced that broader connections deserved closer examination. One of the recurring themes that emerged involved preparation. Crime scene analysis suggested that the offender often selected locations offering multiple avenues of escape. Residential neighborhoods bordered by open spaces, parks, or drainage corridors appeared repeatedly throughout investigative maps. Detectives increasingly believed these environmental features were unlikely to be coincidental. Behavioral analysts also noted that the offender consistently demonstrated patience. Rather than relying on spontaneous opportunity, the available evidence indicated advanced planning. Homes appeared to have been observed beforehand. Entry points were chosen carefully. The offender seemed comfortable operating in darkness while minimizing unnecessary noise and avoiding confrontation with neighbors. Such observations did not identify a suspect. They did, however, reinforce the impression that investigators faced an unusually organized offender. As forensic science gradually advanced during the late 1970s and early 1980s, laboratories continued preserving evidence that could not yet be fully analyzed using existing technology. Detectives understood that scientific capabilities would improve over time. Even when immediate answers proved impossible, properly collected evidence retained long-term value. This commitment to preservation would later become one of the most important decisions made throughout the investigation. Meanwhile, the emotional impact on victims and their families remained profound. Many survivors participated in repeated interviews over the years, providing additional details whenever investigators revisited the cases. Trauma specialists increasingly recognized that memories associated with violent crimes can surface gradually, and detectives approached follow-up interviews with greater awareness than had been common during earlier decades. Victim advocacy also evolved. Communities that had once focused almost exclusively on apprehending the offender began placing greater emphasis on supporting survivors through counseling, legal assistance, and long-term recovery services. Although these resources varied significantly by jurisdiction, they represented an important shift in how violent crime investigations addressed those most directly affected. The investigation itself continued expanding. Evidence inventories grew. Case files multiplied. Maps filled entire walls inside investigative offices. Photographs, witness statements, laboratory reports, and handwritten notes accumulated into one of California's largest collections of unsolved serial crime evidence. For younger detectives joining the task force, the sheer scale of the investigation could be overwhelming. Many inherited cases that had already consumed years of work by predecessors who had retired or transferred. Each new investigator faced the same challenge: absorb thousands of pages of documentation without overlooking a single potentially significant detail. This continuity proved essential. Experienced investigators understood that solving long-running cases often depends less on dramatic breakthroughs than on disciplined record-keeping. Every interview, every laboratory result, and every preserved exhibit created opportunities for future comparison. During these years, public attention gradually shifted elsewhere. New crimes dominated headlines. Other investigations captured national interest. Yet for those directly involved, the case never truly disappeared. Families of victims continued seeking answers. Retired detectives continued discussing theories. Evidence technicians ensured critical exhibits remained properly stored despite the passage of time. Occasionally, new leads emerged. Individuals contacted police claiming knowledge of the offender's identity. Anonymous letters arrived. Witnesses reconsidered observations made years earlier. Each lead underwent careful evaluation. Most ultimately proved unsupported. Still, investigators understood that unsolved cases can turn unexpectedly on information received decades after the original offense. As criminal profiling matured as an investigative discipline, experts revisited the available evidence with fresh perspectives. Rather than attempting to describe the offender's personality in dramatic terms, analysts concentrated on observable behaviors. The offender appeared adaptable. He demonstrated confidence in unfamiliar environments. He accepted considerable personal risk while repeatedly avoiding identification. His crimes suggested planning rather than impulse. These conclusions aligned with many observations made by detectives during the original investigations. Importantly, however, profiling remained only one investigative tool among many. It could suggest possibilities, but it could not replace physical evidence or independently identify a suspect. Forensic evidence remained the strongest path forward. Throughout the 1980s, scientific advances transformed criminal investigations across the United States. DNA profiling emerged as an increasingly valuable technique, initially available only in limited circumstances but rapidly demonstrating extraordinary potential. Investigators responsible for the California serial offender cases recognized its significance almost immediately. Evidence preserved years earlier suddenly possessed new importance. Items that had once yielded only limited forensic information could now contribute to genetic analysis under appropriate laboratory conditions. Testing began linking cases with greater certainty than had previously been possible. Separate investigations once believed unrelated increasingly pointed toward a single offender. Perhaps the most significant realization concerned identity. The individual responsible for the East Area Rapist series and the offender known in Southern California as the original Night Stalker were not separate criminals. They were the same person. This conclusion fundamentally reshaped the investigation. Cases previously managed independently now became chapters within one extraordinarily complex criminal history. The revelation also altered public understanding. What had once appeared to be multiple dangerous offenders operating in different regions of California was, according to the accumulating forensic evidence, a single individual whose criminal activity had crossed geographic boundaries over many years. And law enforcement agencies responded by strengthening cooperation. Evidence was compared systematically across jurisdictions. Investigative strategies were updated to reflect the newly established connections. Detectives who had spent years pursuing apparently separate offenders now found themselves working toward a common objective. Even with this breakthrough, however, one critical question remained unanswered. Who was he? The DNA profile established that numerous crimes had been committed by the same individual. It did not provide his name. National DNA databases expanded steadily during the following decades, enabling investigators to solve many violent crimes by matching crime scene evidence to known offenders whose DNA had been collected following arrests or convictions. The California serial offender case entered those databases as well. Investigators waited. Months became years. Years became decades. A no match appeared. The absence of a database hit suggested several possibilities. The offender may never have been arrested for an offense requiring DNA collection. He may have avoided detection entirely after the known crimes ended, or his DNA simply had not entered the available systems. Whatever the explanation, the investigation reached another difficult plateau. The evidence identified one offender with remarkable certainty, yet that certainty stopped just short of revealing his identity. For many observers, the case seemed destined to remain one of America's greatest unsolved investigations. Among the detectives who continued reviewing evidence, however, optimism persisted. Science had already accomplished what once seemed impossible by linking crimes across years and counties. If technology had advanced this far, perhaps future innovations would carry the investigation one final step. No one knew exactly what that future method would look like. No one imagined it would involve techniques borrowed from family history research rather than traditional policing. But quietly, inside evidence rooms where carefully preserved exhibits had remained untouched for decades, the material needed for that final breakthrough was already waiting. It simply required a scientific approach that had not yet been invented. As the investigation entered the 1990s and early 2000s, the Golden State Killer case occupied a unique place in American criminal justice. It was no longer simply an active investigation, nor was it considered abandoned. Instead, it became what detectives often describe as a living cold case, one that continued to evolve despite the passage of time. The offender had apparently disappeared from public view, yet the evidence he left behind remained preserved with extraordinary care, waiting for scientific advances that investigators hoped would eventually provide answers. Cold cases present challenges unlike those encountered during active investigations. Witnesses move away. Memories naturally fade. Investigators retire. Neighborhoods change. Buildings are demolished. Records must be transferred from one generation of detectives to the next. Without meticulous documentation, decades of investigative work can be lost. Recognizing those risks, agencies responsible for the Golden State Killer investigation invested significant effort in preserving evidence, organizing files, and maintaining detailed case histories. Detectives who inherited the investigation often spent months reviewing reports created years earlier, studying crime scene photographs, laboratory findings, maps, and interview transcripts before pursuing new leads. One recurring principle guided these efforts: never assume the case is over. History had repeatedly shown that advances in forensic science could transform seemingly impossible investigations. Fingerprint analysis, computerized databases, improved laboratory techniques, and increasingly sophisticated DNA testing had already solved countless crimes once believed unsolvable. Many investigators believed this case would eventually follow the same path. The question was not whether science would improve. It was whether the preserved evidence would remain suitable for future testing. Fortunately, the answer appeared to be yes. During this period, DNA profiling itself continued advancing at a remarkable pace. Laboratories developed methods capable of extracting genetic material from increasingly small or degraded samples. Improved analytical techniques produced clearer DNA profiles than had been possible only a decade earlier. National databases also expanded, allowing investigators to compare evidence against growing collections of offender profiles. The Golden State Killer case benefited from every one of these developments. Yet despite repeated submissions and updated testing, the result remained unchanged. No direct match. For many investigators, this outcome proved deeply frustrating. The DNA profile was considered highly reliable. The offender's genetic signature existed. It simply did not correspond to anyone within the available criminal databases. That realization forced detectives to reconsider long-held assumptions. Perhaps the offender had never been convicted of an offense requiring DNA collection. Perhaps he had lived an apparently ordinary life after the crimes ended. Perhaps he had successfully avoided significant contact with law enforcement for decades. Each possibility seemed plausible. None produced a name. Meanwhile, public interest in the case experienced periodic revivals. Books examining unsolved serial crimes devoted extensive chapters to the investigation. Television documentaries revisited the evidence, interviewing retired detectives, forensic specialists, journalists, and victim advocates. These programs introduced the case to younger audiences who had not experienced the fear that gripped California during the original crimes. Importantly, investigators approached such media attention with caution. Public awareness generated useful tips, but it also encouraged speculation. Detectives distinguished carefully between verified evidence and unsupported theories, emphasizing that successful investigations depend upon facts rather than assumptions. Among those who helped sustain public attention was crime writer Michelle McNamara, whose extensive research brought renewed national focus to the case. Through interviews with investigators and detailed examination of historical records, she highlighted the remarkable complexity of the investigation while emphasizing the importance of continued forensic work. Her efforts also popularized the term Golden State Killer, a name that reflected the offender's crimes across multiple regions of California rather than the earlier titles associated with individual investigations. Although McNamara passed away before the case was solved, her work contributed to renewed public interest and reinforced the determination of investigators who had spent decades pursuing answers. Behind the scenes, forensic science continued moving forward. One emerging field attracted growing attention among genetic researchers: genealogy. For generations, family historians had traced ancestry through birth certificates, census records, marriage licenses, immigration documents, and family trees. As commercial DNA testing became increasingly popular, millions of individuals voluntarily submitted genetic samples to learn more about their ancestral origins and biological relatives. Initially, These services focused entirely on genealogy rather than criminal investigations. Participants hoped to discover distant cousins, reconstruct family histories, or explore ancestral migration patterns. Few imagined that the same underlying genetic principles might someday influence major criminal investigations. Researchers, however, recognized intriguing possibilities. Unlike traditional law enforcement DNA databases, which seek exact matches between crime scene evidence and known offenders, genealogical analysis could identify partial genetic relationships among distant relatives. In theory, an unknown DNA profile might not identify an individual directly. It might instead identify cousins, second cousins, their cousins, individuals sharing common ancestors generations earlier. From there, traditional genealogical research could narrow potential family lines. The concept appeared promising. It also presented enormous practical challenges. Constructing family trees extending across multiple generations required painstaking historical research. Census records, birth certificates, marriage records, military documents, newspaper archives, cemetery records, and countless other historical sources needed careful examination. Even after identifying potential family branches, investigators would still need to determine which individuals match the offender's estimated age, sex, geographic history, and other known characteristics. It was neither simple nor fast, nor was it widely accepted. During the early years of investigative genetic genealogy, the technique remained largely experimental. Only a handful of specialists possessed the combined expertise necessary to integrate forensic genetics with traditional genealogical research. Law enforcement agencies watched these developments with considerable interest, as some viewed the method cautiously. Others recognized extraordinary potential. The Golden State Killer investigation soon emerged as one of the cases where such an approach might prove valuable. Detectives already possessed an exceptionally strong DNA profile. What they lacked was an identity. Genetic genealogy offered a possible bridge between those two facts. Careful planning followed. Investigators consulted forensic scientists, prosecutors, and genealogical experts to evaluate whether the technique could be applied responsibly and effectively. Any investigative strategy needed to satisfy legal requirements while maintaining scientific integrity. The objective remained straightforward: generate leads, not convictions. Even if genealogy suggested a particular family, traditional police investigation would still be required. Detectives would need to verify timelines, eliminate innocent individuals, and ultimately obtain legally admissible evidence connecting a specific suspect to the crimes. Genealogy could point investigators toward possibilities. It could not replace conventional investigative work. This distinction remained essential throughout the planning process. By the mid-2010s, improvements in DNA sequencing and genealogical databases made the approach increasingly practical. Investigators selected preserved crime scene DNA for advanced analysis and worked with specialists capable of converting forensic profiles into formats suitable for genealogical comparison where legally permissible. The process unfolded gradually. There was no dramatic moment, no flashing computer screen announcing the offender's name. Instead, researchers began identifying distant biological relationships, then additional relationships, family branches, historical records, marriage connections, geographic movements. Generation by generation, an enormous family tree began taking shape. The number of possible individuals steadily decreased. Each eliminated branch brought investigators slightly closer to the unknown offender who had evaded identification for decades. What had once seemed an impossible search among millions of California residents gradually became a manageable investigation involving a much smaller group of related individuals. Traditional detective work now returned to the forefront. Investigators compared ages, military histories, employment records, residential locations, known movements, physical descriptions. Every verified fact from the original investigation acquired renewed importance. The crimes themselves had not changed. The evidence had not changed. Only the investigative pathway had changed. For the first time in decades, detectives sensed they might be approaching something tangible, not certainty, but direction. The investigation that had once appeared frozen inside dusty evidence boxes was moving again. Slowly, methodically. Driven not by luck, but by decades of careful evidence preservation combined with scientific innovation. The breakthrough many investigators had anticipated for nearly 40 years no longer seemed hypothetical. It was beginning to take shape. Somewhere within those expanding family trees was a man who had spent decades living beyond public suspicion. If the genealogical evidence continued pointing in the same direction, detectives would soon face the moment they had imagined throughout their careers. Not the end of the investigation. The beginning of its final chapter. By early 2018, the investigation had entered a phase unlike any it had experienced during the previous 4 decades. The breakthrough had not come from a confession, a forgotten witness, or a routine traffic stop. Instead, it emerged through the careful combination of preserved forensic evidence, genetic genealogy, and traditional detective work. Years of scientific progress had transformed a case once considered nearly impossible into one with a realistic investigative path. The genealogical analysis had not identified a single individual outright. Rather, it produced a network of distant biological relatives connected through shared ancestry. Genealogists worked methodically, tracing family lines across multiple generations. Every birth record, marriage certificate, census entry, obituary, and public document helped refine an enormous family tree. From that point forward, experienced detectives applied the same investigative principles that had guided the case for decades. Who fit the known timeline? Who lived in California during the relevant years? Who matched the estimated age? Who had geographical connections consistent with the crimes? Every answer narrowed the field. Eventually, attention focused on one family branch that appeared increasingly consistent with the available evidence. Within that branch was a man named Joseph James D'Angelo. The name itself meant little to most investigators at first. It was simply one candidate among several requiring careful examination. Detectives understood the importance of avoiding premature conclusions. A genealogical lead was not proof. Every possibility had to be tested against independently verified evidence. Background research began quietly. Public records established that D'Angelo had served in the U.S. Navy during the 1960s. After his military service, he studied criminal justice and later became a police officer in California during the 1970s before eventually working in another profession. For investigators, these facts were noteworthy but not conclusive. They did not establish guilt. They simply aligned with several long-discussed investigative theories about the offender's familiarity with law enforcement procedures and discipline methods. The investigation remained confidential. Only a limited number of people knew how close detectives believed they might be to identifying their suspect. Maintaining secrecy was essential. If investigators were wrong, an innocent man's reputation could be unfairly damaged. If they were right, any indication that police were closing in might jeopardize the investigation. Surveillance teams were assembled. Their mission was straightforward. Observe. Document. Do not intervene. Detectives monitored D'Angelo's daily routine from public locations. They noted his movements, his habits, and the vehicles he used. Nothing about his outward appearance suggested that he had spent decades at the center of one of America's most notorious unsolved investigations. He appeared to live an ordinary suburban life. Neighbors generally described him as private. Some recalled seeing him working around his property or performing routine household tasks. Others knew little about him beyond casual greetings. For detectives who had devoted years to the case, this contrast was striking. The man under surveillance did not resemble the terrifying figure described throughout thousands of investigative reports. He was now in his 70s. Time had changed his appearance. But time could not erase DNA. Investigators now faced a crucial evidentiary step. To confirm whether D'Angelo's genetic profile matched the preserved crime scene evidence, they needed a lawfully obtained DNA sample suitable for comparison. Because no direct sample had yet been collected from him through arrest or voluntary cooperation, detectives relied on a well-established investigative technique. They conducted discreet surveillance while waiting for an opportunity to recover an item that had been discarded in a public place. The principle behind this approach was simple. Once an object has been lawfully abandoned in a public setting, It may be collected and examined as part of a criminal investigation, subject to applicable legal standards. Investigators recovered discarded items believed to contain biological material. The evidence was submitted for forensic analysis. Laboratory scientists compared the DNA profile obtained from those items with the profile preserved from the historic crime scenes. The comparison was conducted using rigorous scientific procedures. The investigators waited. After decades of uncertainty, the answer depended not on speculation but on measurable genetic evidence. The laboratory results indicated that the DNA from the discarded material was consistent with the DNA profile developed from the crime scene evidence. For detectives, this represented a pivotal moment. Years of investigative work had converged. The genealogical research, the historical records, the surveillance, the forensic testing. Together, they pointed to the same individual. Even then, investigators proceeded carefully. Additional legal review took place. Evidence was organized. Historical records were re-examined. Prosecutors worked closely with detectives to ensure that every step met the legal standards required for what would become one of the most significant arrests in modern criminal investigative history. The objective was not merely to identify a suspect. It was to build a case capable of surviving intense judicial scrutiny. Given the extraordinary public interest the investigation would inevitably generate, every decision required meticulous attention. On April 24, 2018, law enforcement officers arrested Joseph James D'Angelo at his home in Citrus Heights, California. The announcement reverberated across the United States. News organizations interrupted regular programming. Television networks aired special reports. Newspapers published front-page headlines within hours. For many Californians who had lived through the crimes decades earlier, the news felt almost unreal. The investigation they had followed for so many years had finally produced an arrest. Retired detectives received telephone calls from former colleagues. Victims and family members learned that the case which had shaped so much of their lives had entered an entirely new chapter. Many described experiencing a mixture of relief, disbelief, and overwhelming emotion. Some had feared they would never see meaningful progress during their lifetimes. Others had continued hoping, despite the passage of decades, that science would eventually succeed where traditional investigative methods had reached their limits. The arrest also drew international attention to investigative genetic genealogy. Experts emphasized that the technique had not replaced conventional police work. Rather, it had generated a lead. Everything that followed depended upon careful detective work, surveillance, forensic confirmation, and legal procedure. Without the preserved crime scene evidence, genealogy alone would not have solved the case. Without experienced investigators capable of interpreting decades of records, the family tree might never have led to the correct individual. Without advances in DNA technology, the original evidence might have remained scientifically unusable. The case represented the convergence of multiple disciplines developed over many years. Legal scholars, forensic scientists, and law enforcement agencies throughout the world began examining the investigation closely. Many viewed it as a landmark example of how emerging technology could assist long unsolved criminal cases. At the same time, discussions emerged regarding privacy, genealogy databases, and the ethical use of genetic information in criminal investigations. Those conversations would continue long after the arrest itself. Meanwhile, prosecutors prepared formal charges based on the available evidence. Because many offenses had occurred decades earlier, investigators carefully evaluated applicable statutes, evidentiary requirements, and procedural considerations. The homicide charges ultimately formed the foundation of the prosecution, supported by extensive forensic evidence and the preserved investigative record accumulated across generations of detectives. For the victims and their families, however, the legal process represented something deeper than courtroom procedure. It represented acknowledgement. For decades, they had lived with unanswered questions. Many had participated repeatedly in interviews, evidence collection, and investigative reviews. Some had watched investigators retire while the case remained unresolved. Now, for the first time, they would have an opportunity to see the judicial system confront the man prosecutors alleged had committed those crimes. The arrest did not erase the suffering endured over so many years, nor could it restore what had been lost. But it marked the end of one of the longest and most determined criminal investigations in California history. The mystery of identity had finally been answered. The next challenge would unfold inside the courtroom, where decades of evidence, scientific innovation, and painstaking investigative work would be examined under the highest legal standards before the world watched. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo marked the beginning of a new phase in the case, but it did not immediately bring closure in many respects. The investigation entered one of its most demanding periods. Detectives who had spent years identifying a suspect now shifted their attention toward preparing one of the most extensive criminal prosecutions in California history. Every piece of evidence preserved over for decades would need to withstand careful examination in court. The scale of the case was extraordinary. Multiple counties were involved. Numerous investigative agencies had contributed evidence. Thousands of reports had been generated across different decades. Physical exhibits, laboratory records, witness statements, and historical documents had to be organized into a coherent evidentiary record. For prosecutors, this required close cooperation with detectives, forensic scientists, evidence custodians, and legal specialists from across California. The passage of time presented obvious challenges. Some original investigators had retired. Others had passed away. Several witnesses were elderly. Certain physical locations connected to the investigation had changed dramatically since the crimes occurred. Yet because investigators had carefully documented their work over many years, the historical record remained remarkably complete. This continuity proved invaluable. Evidence collected during the original investigations had been preserved according to professional standards. Laboratory reports had been retained. Chain of custody documentation allowed prosecutors to demonstrate how evidence had been handled throughout decades of storage and analysis. Modern forensic testing could therefore be understood within the broader historical context of the original investigations. As court proceedings developed, prosecutors announced numerous charges connected to murders committed across several California jurisdictions. Those homicide counts carried particular legal significance because they remained prosecutable despite the passage of decades. Many other offenses associated with the investigation had occurred too long ago to be prosecuted directly under applicable statutes of limitation. Nevertheless, investigators continued recognizing the experiences of survivors whose cooperation had been essential throughout the investigation. Their testimony, historical records, and preserved evidence remained important in establishing the broader history of the case. The public response to the arrest remained intense. Court hearings attracted widespread media attention. Journalists from across the United States and from abroad covered each procedural development. Television networks revisited archival footage from the original investigations, comparing scenes from the 1970s with contemporary images of the defendant entering court. For many viewers, the contrast was striking. The crimes had occurred during an era of rotary telephones, handwritten police reports, and analog forensic science. Now, decades later, digital technology, advanced DNA analysis, and investigative genetic genealogy had reshaped the landscape of criminal investigation. Victims and survivors also began speaking publicly about their experiences. Some had waited more than 40 years to learn the identity of the person investigators believed responsible. Their interviews emphasized not only the original crimes, but also the lasting effects that violent victimization can have throughout an individual's life. Many described years spent rebuilding routines, relationships, and a sense of personal safety. Others reflected on the uncertainty created by decades without answers. The arrest, while significant, did not erase those experiences. Instead, it offered an opportunity for long-delayed accountability through the judicial process. Throughout the proceedings, Cortez remained focused on established legal principles. The defendant retained the constitutional rights afforded in every criminal case, including the presumption of innocence unless proven guilty according to law and the right to legal representation. These safeguards are fundamental to the American justice system, regardless of the seriousness of the allegations. Meanwhile, prosecutors continued assembling evidence supporting the charges. The DNA evidence remained central. Investigators explained how preserved biological evidence from historical crime scenes had been analyzed using modern laboratory techniques. Expert witnesses were prepared to describe the scientific processes underlying DNA profiling, statistical analysis, and forensic comparison. Equally important was the extensive documentary record. Historical reports demonstrated investigative continuity spanning multiple decades. Detectives from different generations described how evidence had been collected, preserved, re-examined, and ultimately connected through advancing forensic science. The case illustrated an important reality of long-term investigations. Scientific breakthroughs rarely stand alone. They depend upon earlier investigators who collected evidence carefully, preserved it properly, and documented every step thoroughly, even when available technology could not yet provide definitive answers. Without those foundational efforts, later advances might never have been possible. The investigation also prompted broader discussions within law enforcement. Agencies across the United States began reviewing unsolved violent crime cases that contained preserved biological evidence. Detectives considered whether investigative genetic genealogy might assist other long-dormant investigations, provided legal standards and ethical guidelines were followed. Over the next several years, numerous cold cases would indeed be reopened using similar methods, although each investigation required independent evidence, judicial oversight, and careful scientific evaluation. The Golden State Killer investigation thus became influential beyond California. Training programs, forensic conferences, and academic publications examined the investigative process in detail. Researchers highlighted several lessons. Preserve evidence whenever possible. Maintain complete documentation. Encourage cooperation across jurisdictions. Remain open to scientific innovation. Perhaps most importantly, recognize that an unsolved case today may become solvable tomorrow. As legal proceedings continued, the practical realities of the defendant's age also became relevant. Joseph James D'Angelo was in his 70s at the time of his arrest. Medical evaluations, courtroom accommodations, and procedural scheduling reflected the fact that decades had elapsed since the original crimes. Nonetheless, prosecutors maintained that the available evidence justified moving forward. The passage of time, they argued, had not diminished the seriousness of the offenses. For victims and families, every court appearance carried emotional weight. Some attended hearings in person. Others followed developments through news reports. Victim advocates remained available to provide support throughout the process, recognizing that legal proceedings involving historical crimes can reopen painful memories even many years after the original events. As preparations advanced, discussions eventually turned toward the possibility of resolving the case without a lengthy trial. Complex criminal prosecutions often involve negotiations between prosecutors and defense attorneys regarding potential plea agreements. Any such discussions must balance numerous considerations, including the strength of available evidence, the interests of victims, judicial efficiency, and the likelihood of obtaining reliable testimony concerning events that occurred decades earlier. Ultimately, prosecutors announced that a comprehensive resolution had been reached. Under the agreement, Joseph James D'Angelo admitted responsibility for multiple murders and acknowledged numerous additional offenses connected to the broader investigation. The plea agreement ensured that victims and their families would not be required to endure years of contested trial proceedings while still establishing formal accountability within the criminal justice system. Before sentencing, the court conducted extensive victim impact proceedings. These hearings provided survivors and family members an opportunity to describe in their own words the lasting consequences of crimes committed decades earlier. The statements reflected a wide range of experiences. Some spoke quietly. Others expressed anger. Many described lives permanently altered by fear, grief, or loss. Although every person's experience differed, a common theme emerged. Time had passed. The impact had not. The courtroom became more than a place for legal argument. It became a space where decades of silence, uncertainty, and unanswered questions were finally acknowledged within the justice system. For investigators who had devoted substantial portions of their careers to the case, these proceedings represented the culmination of years of persistence. Many had never expected to witness such an outcome. Some original detectives had spent their professional lives searching for an unknown offender whose identity remained hidden despite extraordinary effort. Now, through the combined work of multiple generations of investigators and scientists, the case had reached the point where the judicial system could render its final judgment. Yet beyond the courtroom, the broader legacy of the investigation was already becoming clear. The Golden State Killer case had changed more than one criminal investigation. It had transformed how many agencies viewed cold cases, forensic evidence, and the possibilities created by responsible scientific innovation. Its influence would extend far beyond the final sentence imposed by the court, shaping homicide investigations for years to come. The sentencing proceedings represented one of the most significant moments in the history of the investigation. More than 40 years had passed since many of the crimes had first been reported, yet the courtroom now brought together individuals whose lives had remained connected through a single unresolved case. Survivors, family members, retired detectives, prosecutors, forensic scientists, victim advocates, and members of the public witnessed the conclusion of a legal process that had stretched across generations. In August 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo formally admitted responsibility under a negotiated plea agreement. By doing so, he accepted accountability for multiple murders and acknowledged numerous additional offenses that investigators had connected through decades of forensic work. The agreement eliminated the need for lengthy criminal trials while ensuring that the court could impose a sentence reflecting the seriousness of the crimes. One of the most powerful aspects of the proceedings came during the victim impact statements. These statements occupy an important place within the criminal justice system. They allow survivors and family members to explain in their own words how violent crime has affected their lives. Rather than focusing exclusively on evidence or legal arguments, the court hears directly from those who have lived with the consequences long after investigators completed their work. Many individuals described years of anxiety, disrupted relationships, interrupted careers, and the enduring emotional impact of trauma. Some spoke about loved ones whose lives ended abruptly. Others reflected on decades spent wondering whether the offender would ever be identified. Several expressed gratitude to investigators who had refused to abandon the case despite repeated setbacks. The statements varied greatly in tone. Some were measured and reflective. Others conveyed profound grief. Some focused on resilience and survival. Together, they illustrated a reality often overlooked in discussions of cold cases. An investigation may become inactive. The effects on victims do not. For detectives present in the courtroom, the hearings also carried deep professional significance. Many had inherited portions of the investigation from predecessors who never witnessed its resolution. Retired investigators sat alongside active detectives, representing successive generations of law enforcement personnel connected by a common objective. The case had outlasted careers. It had survived changes in leadership, advances in forensic science, and dramatic shifts in investigative technology. Yet the underlying commitment remained constant. Preserve the evidence. Follow the facts. Never stop searching for the truth. The court ultimately sentenced DeAngelo to multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected both the gravity of the crimes and the terms of the negotiated plea agreement. For many observers, however, the legal outcome represented only part of the story. Equally significant was the investigative journey that had made the prosecution possible. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated that evidence collected decades earlier could retain extraordinary value when preserved carefully. Crime scene technicians who documented evidence during the 1970s had no knowledge of modern DNA sequencing or investigative genetic genealogy. Nevertheless, their commitment to thorough evidence collection ensured that future scientists would have material capable of supporting entirely new methods of analysis. And the investigation became a case study in forensic persistence. Police academies, universities, and professional conferences, forensic laboratories. Many began examining the case not only because of its historical importance, but also because it illustrated fundamental investigative principles applicable to countless other cold cases. One lesson stood above the rest. Technology changes. Good investigative work endures. Every properly labeled exhibit. Every accurately recorded interview. Every carefully maintained chain of custody, every preserved photograph, each became part of a foundation upon which future scientific discoveries could build. The case also accelerated discussions surrounding investigative genetic genealogy. Law enforcement agencies across the United States explored whether similar techniques might assist unresolved homicide and sexual assault investigations involving preserved biological evidence. At the same time, legal scholars, ethicists, privacy advocates, and policymakers examined important questions regarding the responsible use of genealogical databases. How should genetic information be accessed? Under what circumstances should law enforcement use these methods? What safeguards should exist to protect individual privacy while allowing investigators to solve serious violent crimes? These conversations continue today. Many jurisdictions have since developed formal policies governing investigative genetic genealogy, emphasizing judicial oversight, transparency, and careful adherence to legal standards. The Golden State Killer investigation played a central role in prompting those developments. Meanwhile, detectives who had worked the case often reflected upon another aspect of the investigation rarely visible to the public: patience. The investigation unfolded over nearly half a century. Most breakthroughs did not occur dramatically. They emerged gradually. One laboratory improvement, one preserved exhibit, one historical record, one carefully documented family connection. Progress accumulated through thousands of deliberate decisions made by countless individuals over many years. The final identification of the suspect represented the culmination of that collective effort rather than the achievement of any single person. Historians of criminal investigation frequently point to the extraordinary level of interagency cooperation involved. Local police departments, county sheriff's offices, state laboratories, federal partners, forensic scientists, genealogists, prosecutors, victim advocates. Each contributed specialized expertise at different stages of the investigation. The result demonstrated what sustained collaboration can accomplish in exceptionally complex cases. The case also reinforced an important principle regarding unsolved investigations. Time itself is neither an ally nor an enemy. While memories naturally become less precise and witnesses may become more difficult to locate, scientific knowledge often advances. Methods unavailable during one decade may become routine during the next. For that reason, many agencies increasingly review older cases whenever significant forensic innovations emerge. The Golden State Killer investigation provided compelling evidence that such reviews can produce meaningful results. For survivors and families, however, the broader legacy remained deeply personal. The arrest and sentencing could not undo decades of suffering. No judicial proceeding could restore lost loved ones or erase traumatic memories. Yet many expressed appreciation that the justice system had ultimately identified the individual responsible through lawful investigation and scientific evidence. That outcome mattered profoundly, not because it changed the past, because it acknowledged the truth. The investigation also left a lasting mark on California itself. Communities that had once lived under the shadow of an unknown offender became part of one of the most influential criminal investigations in modern American history. Neighborhoods where residents had once organized evening patrols and checked locks repeatedly before bedtime became symbols of resilience rather than fear alone. The crimes were remembered. So too was the determination to solve them. Looking back across nearly 50 years, the chronology of the case reveals a remarkable evolution in criminal investigation. The earliest detectives relied primarily upon witness interviews, physical evidence, fingerprints, shoe impressions, neighborhood canvases, and painstaking manual record-keeping. Later investigators added increasingly sophisticated forensic techniques. Eventually, DNA analysis transformed the evidentiary landscape. Finally, investigative genetic genealogy provided the lead that traditional databases could not. Each generation inherited the work of those who came before. Each added something new. None succeeded alone. That continuity remains one of the investigation's most enduring lessons. Although the criminal proceedings had reached their conclusion, the case continued influencing research, forensic science, investigative policy, and public understanding of cold cases. Universities incorporated the investigation into criminal justice curricula. Forensic laboratories cited it when discussing evidence preservation. Law enforcement agencies reviewed historical cases with renewed optimism. Many detectives who had once viewed decades-old investigations as permanently unsolved began reconsidering what future scientific advances might achieve. In that sense, the Golden State Killer case became more than a remarkable criminal investigation. It became evidence that persistence, careful documentation, scientific innovation, and institutional memory can converge across generations to resolve even the most difficult cases. Its legacy extends far beyond the courtroom. It continues every time an investigator carefully preserves evidence from a new crime scene, believing that even if today's technology cannot provide every answer, tomorrow's might. The conclusion of the Golden State Killer investigation did not mark the end of its significance. Instead, it marked the beginning of a broader transformation in criminal investigation, forensic science, and cold case strategy. Long after the arrest, guilty plea, and sentencing, investigators around the world continued studying the case not because of its notoriety alone, but because it demonstrated how decades of careful police work and emerging scientific methods could converge to resolve one of the most challenging investigations in modern American history. Perhaps the most enduring lesson concerns evidence preservation. When detectives first processed the original crime scenes during the 1970s, they had no way of knowing that future generations would possess technologies capable of extracting far more information from biological evidence than was then possible. Nevertheless, investigators followed established forensic procedures, documenting scenes carefully, collecting physical evidence systematically, and maintaining detailed records. Those decisions proved invaluable. Evidence that could not fully answer investigators' questions in one era became critically important in another. The case underscored a simple but powerful principle now emphasized in forensic training around the world: collect thoroughly, preserve carefully, and assume that scientific capabilities will continue to improve. Modern crime laboratories routinely cite this approach as a cornerstone of cold case investigation. The Golden State Killer case also transformed the way many agencies think about long unsolved investigations. For decades, cold cases were often viewed as investigations with diminishing prospects. Detectives certainly continued reviewing evidence, but available investigative tools frequently limited progress. The success of investigative genetic genealogy challenged that perception. Rather than asking whether a case was too old to solve, many investigators began asking a different question: has science changed since the last review? That shift in perspective encouraged agencies to reopen numerous historical investigations involving preserved biological evidence. Specialized cold case units expanded in several jurisdictions, bringing together experienced investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and genealogical experts to reassess evidence collected years or even decades earlier. Many of those reviews produced meaningful results. The influence of the Golden State Killer investigation extended well beyond California. Law enforcement agencies across the United States began evaluating whether investigative genetic genealogy could assist in identifying unknown offenders or unidentified human remains. Universities incorporated the case into criminal justice curricula, while forensic conferences examined the investigative process as a model of interdisciplinary cooperation. Importantly, professionals consistently emphasize that genealogy alone does not solve criminal cases. Investigative genetic genealogy is fundamentally a lead generation technique. It suggests possible family connections. Detectives must still verify every lead through conventional investigative methods: background research, historical records, witness interviews, surveillance conducted within the law, independent forensic confirmation. Only after these steps can investigators determine whether a genealogical lead withstands legal and scientific scrutiny. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated that success depended on the integration of multiple investigative disciplines rather than any single technological breakthrough. The investigation also accelerated important discussions about ethics and privacy. Millions of people had voluntarily submitted DNA samples to genealogy services in hopes of learning more about their family histories. As law enforcement agencies began exploring investigative uses for publicly accessible genetic information, questions naturally emerged regarding appropriate safeguards. Legal scholars, policymakers, privacy advocates, and forensic scientists engaged in extensive debate. How should these databases be accessed? Under what circumstances should investigative genetic genealogy be used? Should the technique be limited to the investigation of serious violent crimes? What level of judicial oversight is appropriate? These conversations continue to shape policy today. Many agencies have adopted formal guidelines governing investigative genetic genealogy. Although procedures vary by jurisdiction, common principles include limiting the technique to the investigation of the most serious offenses, requiring supervisory approval, documenting investigative decisions carefully, and ensuring that genealogy serves as one investigative tool rather than definitive proof of identity. The Golden State Killer investigation became a central reference point in those policy discussions. Another lasting legacy involves interagency cooperation. The investigation spanned multiple counties, numerous police departments, sheriff's offices, forensic laboratories, prosecutors' offices, and federal partners. No single agency possessed all of the evidence or expertise required to resolve the case independently. Instead, success emerged through sustained collaboration, information sharing, evidence comparison, a joint investigative planning, coordinated forensic analysis. Today, many complex investigations place even greater emphasis on these collaborative practices, recognizing that offenders often cross jurisdictional boundaries while investigative information should not. The case also reinforced the importance of institutional memory. Large investigations frequently outlast individual careers. Detectives retire, supervisors change, and agencies reorganize. Without careful documentation, valuable knowledge can disappear over time. The Golden State Killer investigation demonstrated how comprehensive records preserve investigative continuity across generations. Crime scene photographs, evidence inventories, laboratory reports, witness interviews, investigative notes. Each contributed to a historical record that remained useful decades after its creation. For modern investigators, the message is clear. Today's documentation may become tomorrow's breakthrough. Victim advocacy represents another area where the case left a meaningful impact. Throughout the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings, increasing attention was given to supporting survivors and families through trauma-informed practices. Victim advocates played an important role by providing information about court proceedings, facilitating communication with investigators, and connecting individuals with counseling and support services. The criminal justice system has evolved considerably since the 1970s, and many agencies now recognize that supporting victims throughout lengthy investigations is essential to both investigative effectiveness and long-term recovery. The Golden State Killer investigation illustrated why that commitment matters. Forensic science itself also continued advancing in response to lessons learned from historical cases. Laboratories refined DNA extraction methods. Quality assurance standards became increasingly rigorous. Digital evidence management systems improved the organization and accessibility of investigative records. Emerging technologies continue expanding the range of forensic techniques available to investigators while emphasizing transparency, scientific validation, and careful peer review. The case serves as a reminder that scientific innovation is most effective when paired with disciplined investigative practice. Public understanding of cold cases has likewise changed. Many people once assumed that unsolved crimes gradually became impossible to resolve as time passed. The Golden State Killer investigation challenged that assumption. While certain investigative opportunities naturally diminish over time, advances in science may simultaneously create entirely new avenues of inquiry. Consequently, investigators increasingly review historical evidence whenever significant technological developments occur. The investigation also highlighted the value of perseverance. The detectives who first responded to these crimes could not have anticipated the forensic methods that would eventually contribute to identifying a suspect, yet their commitment to careful evidence collection created opportunities for future investigators they would never meet. Likewise, later generations built upon the work of those who came before, adding new scientific tools without abandoning established investigative principles. This continuity illustrates one of the defining characteristics of successful cold case work. Every generation contributes something. No investigation succeeds through technology alone. No investigation succeeds through persistence alone. Meaningful progress occurs when experience, science, documentation, and collaboration reinforce one another over time. Today, the Golden State Killer investigation occupies a unique place in the history of criminal justice. It is studied not merely because it ended with an arrest after decades of uncertainty, but because it reshaped professional thinking about what is possible in long unsolved cases. It demonstrated that carefully preserved evidence retains value. It showed that scientific innovation can transform historical investigations. It reinforced the importance of ethical decision-making when adopting new technologies. And it reminded investigators everywhere that patience and meticulous record-keeping are often just as important as dramatic breakthroughs. For future detectives entering the profession, the case offers a lasting lesson. Every crime scene deserves careful attention. Every item of evidence deserves proper preservation. Every report deserves accurate documentation. The answers may not come immediately. In some cases, they may not come for years. But the work completed today may provide the foundation for discoveries that become possible only with tomorrow's science. That enduring lesson, more than any single forensic technique, is the true legacy of the Golden State Killer investigation. It stands as a landmark example of how disciplined investigation, responsible scientific advancement, and sustained cooperation can reshape the future of criminal justice while honoring the principle that unresolved cases should never be forgotten, simply because time has passed. The legacy of the Golden State Killer investigation extends far beyond a single criminal case. Today, it is frequently discussed alongside other landmark investigations that fundamentally changed the practice of modern policing. While the crimes themselves remain a tragic chapter in California's history, the investigative response demonstrated how criminal justice systems can evolve through persistence, scientific advancement, and collaboration across generations. One of the clearest lessons concerns the value of reviewing cold cases with fresh eyes. Historically, many unsolved investigations remained dormant because available evidence had already been examined using every technique of the time. Detectives often reached the practical limits of existing technology rather than the limits of the evidence itself. The Golden State Killer investigation challenged that assumption. It showed that evidence should not be viewed as static. As forensic science advances, previously collected evidence can yield new information without changing the underlying facts of the case. This realization has encouraged law enforcement agencies to establish formal review schedules for unsolved violent crimes, ensuring that older investigations are periodically reassessed whenever significant scientific developments occur. The investigation also highlighted the importance of interdisciplinary expertise. Traditional detectives brought investigative experience. Crime scene specialists ensured evidence was collected and preserved correctly. Forensic scientists developed increasingly sophisticated laboratory analyses. Genetic genealogists contributed specialized knowledge regarding family history research. Prosecutors evaluated legal strategy and evidentiary requirements. Victim advocates supported survivors throughout the judicial process. Each discipline addressed a different aspect of the investigation, illustrating that complex cases often require expertise extending beyond conventional policing alone. Training programs have increasingly reflected this reality. Many police academies and professional development courses now emphasize collaboration across scientific and investigative specialties. Detectives are encouraged not only to understand traditional investigative methods, but also to recognize when specialized expertise may significantly improve an investigation. Another enduring influence involves digital evidence management. When the original crimes occurred, investigative records consisted primarily of handwritten notes, paper reports, photographs, and physical evidence stored in filing systems. Maintaining consistency across multiple jurisdictions required considerable administrative effort. Modern investigations benefit from secure digital record systems capable of organizing large volumes of information more efficiently. Evidence inventories, laboratory reports, interview summaries, and investigative timelines can now be searched, cross-referenced, and shared more effectively among authorized personnel. Although technology has improved record management dramatically, the underlying lesson remains unchanged. Careful documentation matters. Technology enhances organization. It does not replace accuracy. The Golden State Killer investigation also reinforced the importance of forensic quality assurance. Because the case relied heavily upon evidence preserved over many decades, investigators needed complete confidence in laboratory procedures, evidence handling, and chain of custody documentation. This emphasis reflects broader developments within forensic science. Accredited laboratories operate according to standardized procedures designed to ensure reliability, reproducibility, and transparency. Scientific conclusions are expected to withstand independent review and judicial scrutiny. Cases of this magnitude remind investigators that public confidence depends not only upon successful outcomes, but also upon rigorous scientific methodology. The investigation further demonstrated how long-term institutional commitment influences investigative success. Cold cases frequently survive changes in leadership, staffing, and organizational priorities. Without consistent administrative support, evidence preservation, and funding, even well-documented investigations can become increasingly difficult to pursue. Many agencies now maintain dedicated cold case units or assign experienced investigators specifically to unresolved violent crimes. These units preserve institutional knowledge while allowing investigators to revisit historical evidence without sacrificing attention to current investigations. The Golden State Killer investigation remains one of the strongest examples supporting that organizational approach. Public engagement has also evolved. Media coverage throughout the original investigation played an important role in informing communities and generating investigative leads. Decades later, documentaries, books, podcasts, and academic discussions introduced the case to new audiences interested in criminal justice, forensic science, and investigative history. This increased public interest has produced both opportunities and responsibilities. Greater awareness may encourage witnesses to come forward in unresolved cases. At the same time, investigators continue emphasizing the importance of distinguishing verified evidence from speculation. Responsible reporting remains essential. Complex criminal investigations deserve careful presentation grounded in documented facts rather than unsupported theories. Educational institutions have likewise embraced the case as a teaching resource. Students studying criminology, forensic science, criminal procedure, psychology, and public policy frequently examine the investigation from different perspectives. Some focus on forensic innovation. Others examine interagency cooperation. Still others explore ethical questions surrounding emerging investigative technologies. The case therefore serves not merely as historical material, but as an ongoing educational framework for future professionals. International interest has grown as well. Although investigative practices vary among countries, many law enforcement agencies worldwide have followed developments in forensic genealogy with considerable interest. Researchers continue evaluating how similar methods might operate within different legal systems while respecting national privacy laws and evidentiary standards. Not every jurisdiction permits identical investigative approaches. Nevertheless, the broader lessons concerning evidence preservation, scientific advancement, and collaboration possess universal relevance. Another lasting contribution involves public understanding of forensic science itself. Popular culture sometimes portrays criminal investigations as producing immediate scientific answers through highly dramatized laboratory techniques. The Golden State Killer investigation presents a more accurate picture. Scientific breakthroughs required decades of incremental progress. Laboratory methods improved gradually. Computing capabilities expanded over time. Genealogical databases developed independently for entirely different purposes before eventually contributing to criminal investigations under appropriate legal frameworks. The case demonstrates that scientific progress is rarely dramatic in isolation. Rather, meaningful breakthroughs emerge through years of careful research, validation, and practical application. For victims' families and survivors, the legacy remains deeply personal. While the judicial process established accountability, many have emphasized that healing follows no universal timeline. Some individuals found comfort in finally learning the identity of the offender. Others viewed the legal proceedings as one important step within a much longer process of recovery. Their experiences underscore an essential principle increasingly recognized throughout modern criminal justice. Solving a case concludes an investigation. It does not automatically conclude the human consequences of crime. Victim services, therefore, remain an integral component of contemporary investigations, particularly in cases involving significant delays between the offense and eventual prosecution. Looking toward the future, the Golden State Killer investigation continues influencing research into new forensic techniques. Advances in DNA sequencing, digital evidence analysis, forensic genealogy, and investigative data management continue expanding the range of tools available to law enforcement. At the same time, researchers emphasize the need for careful validation, legal oversight, and ethical safeguards before adopting emerging technologies broadly. Innovation and accountability must develop together. Perhaps the investigation's greatest contribution lies in its reminder that perseverance and professionalism remain indispensable regardless of technological change. The detectives who first documented the evidence could not foresee the scientific methods that would later transform the investigation. The forensic scientists who preserved biological material could not predict how future laboratories would analyze it. The investigators who inherited the case continued working despite years without decisive progress. Each generation advanced the investigation a little further. Together, those efforts ultimately produced one of the most significant cold case resolutions in American history. For today's investigators, the message remains both practical and enduring. Treat every crime scene with care. Document every observation accurately. And preserve every viable piece of evidence. Remain open to scientific progress. And recognize that the work completed today may become the key that allows future investigators to answer questions that currently seem impossible to resolve. That philosophy, grounded in patience, evidence, collaboration, and continual learning, remains the most enduring legacy of the Golden State Killer investigation. It is a legacy that continues to influence criminal investigations around the world, reminding investigators that while technology will continue to evolve, the pursuit of truth ultimately depends upon disciplined, ethical, and meticulous investigative work. The Golden State Killer investigation continues to shape criminal justice not because it was extraordinary in isolation, but because it demonstrated how the foundations of effective investigation remain constant even as technology changes. Decades after the original crimes, investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and policymakers continue referring to the case when discussing best practices for solving violent crimes that have remained unsolved for many years. One of the investigation's most significant contributions has been its influence on evidence preservation standards. Every crime scene represents a snapshot in time. Investigators can never predict which item will ultimately prove decisive. A fingerprint that cannot be identified today may become searchable tomorrow. A biological sample considered too limited for meaningful analysis may later yield a complete DNA profile using future laboratory techniques. For this reason, modern forensic training increasingly emphasizes comprehensive documentation and careful preservation over assumptions about immediate investigative value. The Golden State Killer investigation reinforced this philosophy in dramatic fashion. Evidence collected during the 1970s retained investigative significance more than 4 decades later because it had been properly preserved, documented, and stored. The case illustrates that responsible evidence management is not merely an administrative task, it is an investment in future investigative possibilities. The investigation has also become an important example of continuity across generations of law enforcement professionals. Few criminal investigations remain active for nearly half a century. During that period, detectives retire. Laboratory personnel change. Prosecutors leave public service. Supervisors are replaced. Entire organizations evolve. Maintaining momentum under such circumstances requires more than individual dedication. It requires institutional commitment, detailed reports, accurate evidence inventories, organized archives, clear investigative timelines. These resources allow new investigators to understand the work already completed while identifying opportunities for fresh analysis. Without such continuity, important information can easily become fragmented over time. The Golden State Killer investigation demonstrated that careful record-keeping preserves not only evidence, but also investigative knowledge. Another lasting lesson concerns adaptability. The detectives who originally investigated the crimes relied on the strongest methods available during the 1970s. As scientific capabilities improved, later investigators did not abandon earlier work. Instead, they built upon it. Traditional investigative techniques remained essential. Witness interviews, geographic analysis, historical research, evidence comparison, background investigations. These established practices complemented emerging forensic technologies rather than being replaced by them. This balanced approach remains central to successful investigations today. Technology provides powerful tools. Professional judgment determines how those tools are applied. The investigation has likewise influenced discussions regarding collaboration between scientific disciplines. Modern criminal investigations increasingly involve specialists from multiple fields: forensic biologists, DNA analysts, digital evidence experts, crime scene reconstruction specialists, behavioral analysts, genealogical researchers, legal advisors. Each contributes expertise that strengthens the overall investigative process. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated how effective communication among these disciplines can produce results that no individual specialty could achieve independently. Universities have incorporated these lessons into multidisciplinary educational programs preparing future investigators and forensic scientists. Students are encouraged to understand not only their own areas of specialization, but also the contributions made by related disciplines. The case further highlighted the importance of maintaining public confidence through transparency and scientific integrity. Because investigative genetic genealogy represented an emerging technique, investigators and prosecutors emphasized the distinction between an investigative-led and courtroom evidence. Genealogical analysis helped narrow the field of potential suspects. Independent forensic testing and traditional investigative methods established the evidentiary foundation supporting prosecution. This distinction remains important. Scientific innovation must operate within established legal standards. Investigative methods should be understandable, reproducible, and subject to appropriate review. Maintaining these principles strengthens confidence in both forensic science and the criminal justice system. Another enduring impact involves the expansion of dedicated cold case programs. Many agencies have invested additional resources in reviewing historical investigations involving violent crime. Rather than viewing unsolved cases as permanently inactive, departments increasingly recognize that advances in forensic science may justify periodic re-examination. Some jurisdictions have created specialized teams combining experienced investigators with forensic experts and prosecutors specifically assigned to unresolved homicides and sexual assault cases. Although every investigation differs, the Golden State Killer case demonstrated that long-term persistence can produce meaningful results even after decades without significant progress. The investigation has also encouraged continued research into forensic innovation. Scientists continue improving DNA sequencing methods. Laboratories develop techniques requiring smaller quantities of biological material. Researchers explore methods for analyzing degraded evidence while maintaining rigorous quality standards. These advances benefit not only historical investigations but also contemporary criminal cases. The lessons learned from one landmark investigation therefore extend into countless others. Equally important are the ethical discussions that continue surrounding new investigative technologies. As forensic capabilities expand, policymakers, legal scholars, scientists, and community representatives continue evaluating appropriate safeguards. Questions concerning privacy, proportionality, judicial oversight, and responsible use of emerging techniques remain active subjects of professional discussion. The Golden State Killer investigation demonstrated both the promise of scientific innovation and the importance of thoughtful governance. Successful investigations depend not only upon technological capability, but also upon public trust. That trust is strengthened when investigative methods are applied responsibly, transparently, and in accordance with established legal principles. Beyond professional circles, the case has influenced public understanding of cold case investigations. Many people now recognize that the passage of time does not necessarily eliminate the possibility of resolution. Scientific progress continues. Historical records become increasingly accessible through digitization. Analytical methods improve. Cooperation among agencies expands. These developments create opportunities that earlier investigators could not have anticipated. At the same time, the investigation serves as a reminder that successful outcomes require patience. There was no single breakthrough that solved the Golden State Killer case overnight. Progress resulted from decades of incremental work. Evidence was collected. Records were preserved. Laboratory methods advanced. Investigators revisited old assumptions. Specialists collaborated across disciplines. Each step built upon previous efforts. This cumulative process represents the true nature of many complex criminal investigations. The investigation also underscores an important principle regarding professional responsibility. Every detective processing a crime scene today contributes not only to the present investigation, but potentially to future ones. Evidence handled carefully may answer questions years later. Reports written accurately today may guide investigators decades from now. The Golden State Killer case demonstrates that seemingly routine professional standards can have extraordinary long-term consequences. Perhaps that is the investigation's most enduring lesson. Justice is rarely the product of a single moment. More often, it reflects the combined efforts of countless individuals performing their responsibilities with care, accuracy, and persistence across many years. From patrol officers securing crime scenes to forensic technicians preserving evidence, from laboratory scientists refining analytical methods to prosecutors presenting evidence in court, every contribution becomes part of a larger pursuit of truth. Today, the Golden State Killer investigation stands as a landmark in the history of forensic science and criminal investigation. It continues to inform training, influence policy, inspire research, and encourage investigators to revisit difficult cases with renewed determination. Its legacy is not defined solely by the identification of one offender, but by the enduring demonstration that disciplined investigative work, supported by responsible scientific innovation, can bridge generations and bring long unsolved cases closer to resolution. For future investigators, that legacy remains both practical and hopeful. Preserve the evidence, document the facts, follow the science, remain open to new methods, and never assume that an unanswered question will remain unanswered forever. The lasting legacy of the Golden State Killer investigation can perhaps be understood most clearly by looking at what happened after the case was solved. Investigators across the United States began revisiting evidence rooms that contained boxes untouched for years. Homicide detectives reopened files that had long been considered among their department's most difficult mysteries. Forensic laboratories received renewed requests to evaluate biological evidence collected decades earlier. The question being asked was no longer whether a case was old. It was whether preserved evidence might now be analyzed in ways that had once been impossible. This shift in mindset represents one of the investigation's most important contributions to modern policing. Cold cases had always mattered. What changed was the growing belief that many of them remained scientifically actionable. As agencies reviewed historical investigations, they discovered that evidence collected by earlier generations of detectives often possessed greater value than anyone had realized at the time. Properly stored biological material, fingerprints, photographs, maps, and investigative notes could become the foundation for entirely new lines of inquiry. The Golden State Killer case became a powerful example of why evidence preservation should never be treated as a routine administrative responsibility. It is, in many respects, a form of future-proofing, acknowledgement that tomorrow's forensic science may answer questions that today's methods cannot. Another lasting impact has been the professionalization of cold case investigation itself. Historically, unresolved cases were sometimes reassigned intermittently as personnel became available. Today, many agencies maintain dedicated cold case units staffed by investigators with specialized experience in historical evidence review, forensic coordination, and long-term investigative strategy. These units often operate differently from traditional homicide squads. They focus heavily on evidence reanalysis. They collaborate closely with forensic scientists. They conduct extensive archival research. They track technological developments that may affect previously examined evidence. The Golden State Killer investigation helped demonstrate the value of this specialized approach. The case also influenced how investigators think about institutional memory. In a long-running investigation, knowledge can easily become fragmented as detectives retire or transfer to other assignments. To prevent this, many agencies have improved procedures for documenting investigative decisions, preserving case summaries, and maintaining organized digital archives. The goal is straightforward. A detective inheriting a case 20 years later should be able to understand not only what evidence exists, but why earlier investigators made particular decisions. This continuity proved crucial in the Golden State Killer investigation, where multiple generations of detectives contributed to the eventual resolution. Forensic science has likewise continued evolving in ways directly influenced by lessons from the case. Laboratories increasingly emphasize long-term evidence viability. Storage conditions, contamination prevention, and detailed chain of custody